He walks into the swamp before the sun comes up, carrying nothing. No lantern, no rifle. The water is black and warm around his ankles, and the cypress trees close behind him like a door being shut from the inside. The air smells like rot and iron and something older than both. Whatever he's going toward, he's been going toward it his whole life. Nobody wrote his name down. Nobody was supposed to. This is the Okefenokee, and somewhere in its records, the ones the church tried hardest to lose, is a group of people called the Sun Eaters. What they did here, and why it had to be buried, is what this is about. The Okefenokee covers roughly 700 square miles of southeastern Georgia, spreading across Charlton, Clinch, and Ware counties, and spilling into Florida along its southern edge. It sits in a shallow basin that was the floor of an ancient sea, and the land has never fully decided whether it wants to be solid. There are places in there where you can push a pole straight down through the peat and hit nothing firm for 20 feet. Federal surveyors went in during the 1850s and came out with incomplete maps and a general reluctance to go back. The blackwater channels don't run straight, and they don't run the same way twice. Seasonal flooding shifts them, and the floating islands the locals called houses move with the current. You can navigate the Okefenokee if you grew up in it. If you didn't, it will lose you on purpose. Timber companies started circling in the 1870s, drawn by the Atlantic white cedar and the bald cypress, trees that could be cut and floated out if you had the patience and the labor. They built some early access canals along the northern edge, but serious penetration didn't happen until the 1890s, when the Swanee Canal Company attempted a full drainage project that failed expensively and left the swamp largely intact. What that means for this story is that for most of the 1870s, the interior of the Okefenokee was genuinely inaccessible to anyone who didn't already know it. The people who knew it were called swampers, and that word carried a specific meaning. These weren't drifters or hermits. They were families, mostly Scots-Irish in descent, some with Creek intermarriage, some with connections to freedmen communities along the swamp's edges, who had been living in and around the Okefenokee for 2 or 3 generations by the time the Civil War ended. They hunted bear and deer and alligator. They fished the channels with hand lines. They tapped longleaf pine for turpentine and traded it out through Waycross and Folkston. Some of them ran small farms on the hummocks, those slightly elevated patches of ground solid enough to hold a garden and a cabin. They had their own medicine, their own reading of weather and season, their own way of marking time that had more to do with water levels and light angles than with any church calendar. And that last part is exactly where the trouble started. By the early 1870s, Methodist and Baptist mission societies were pushing hard into the rural South, and the Okefenokee region was on their list. Circuit preachers came through on horseback. Mission societies sent money and printed materials. Temperance campaigns followed close behind. The goal, stated plainly in the society correspondence, was to bring the swampers into the fold, to replace what the missionaries called heathen survivals with something they could supervise. What they found when they got there was stranger than they expected, and more resistant. Picture a family waking up on a hummock in the fall of 1873. The cabin is cypress log, chinked with Spanish moss and dried clay, sitting maybe 2 feet above the waterline, on ground that flexes slightly when you walk across it. The father is already out before full light, checking a trap line along a channel half a mile east. The mother is rendering fat from a bear killed 3 days ago, and the smell of it has been in the walls ever since. 2 older children are stripping pine bark for a turpentine batch that'll get loaded onto a flat-bottomed boat and poled out to a buyer in Waycross sometime in the next 2 weeks. That's the economy. It wasn't subsistence in the desperate sense. These families ate, traded, and moved goods with enough regularity that Waycross merchants knew them by name. the Okefenokee wasn't a sealed world. Swampermen showed up in county court records as witnesses, as defendants in minor disputes, as buyers of dry goods and shot and iron. Their kids sometimes went to the one-room schools that existed near the swamp's edge. Some of them voted, but they also carried a body of practice that had nothing to do with the world outside the tree line, and that practice is what matters here. Root medicine was the most visible part of it. Treatments for fever, infection, and snakebite passed down through women in particular, using plants that grew in the swamp, and preparation methods that combined, depending on the family, European herb lore, Creek plant knowledge, and things that seemed to belong to neither tradition cleanly. Animal signs were read seriously, which direction a particular bird flew, whether a certain snake appeared near the house, what the behavior of alligators along a channel predicted about the coming water levels. These weren't superstitions in the casual sense. They were a functional system for reading an environment that formal science hadn't mapped yet. And then there were the seasonal observances, not Christmas, not Easter in any recognizable form, or rather, not only those things. There were gatherings tied to solstice and equinox, to the annual flooding cycle, to the movement of the sun across specific landmarks the swampers used as a kind of calendar. The liturgical year the missionaries brought with them sat awkwardly on top of a system that was already in use and already working. The Methodist and Baptist missionaries who came through in the early 1870s were not stupid men. They recognized what they were looking at, and they named it accurately in their correspondence back to the mission societies. Heathen survivals, they called these practices, borrowing language that had been used in European missionary contexts for generations. The phrase meant something specific. It meant pre-Christian practice that had persisted inside a nominally Christian population without the population being aware, or without them caring, that it was supposed to be gone. What those letters don't quite capture, because the writers weren't looking for it, is that some of these survivals weren't passive remnants at all. Some of them were organized. Some of them were intentional. And one of them had a name. The earliest documentary trace shows up in a letter dated sometime in the winter of 1871 or early 1872. The exact date is unclear because the top corner of the page was damaged before it was archived. The writer was a Methodist circuit preacher working the area around the western edge of the swamp, somewhere in the vicinity of the Sewanee Canal corridor. He was writing back to his district superintendent in Savannah, and most of the letter is routine. How many families he'd visited, how many had agreed to attend services, the condition of the roads. Then, about 2/3 of the way down the page, the tone shifts. He describes being told, by a family he considered cooperative and basically Christian, about a gathering that had taken place the previous autumn. A group of men and women, he writes, had assembled before sunrise near a place he calls the Lower Landing, a name that appears in several Charlton County records from this period, most likely a specific point on a channel used for boat access. They sat in a circle in the dark. They did not speak. They carried with them, or passed among themselves, a vessel containing what his informant described as live coals, or ash, and they remained there, in silence, until the sun was fully above the tree line. The preacher's interpretation of all this was sun worship of a degraded and heathen variety. That phrase tells you more about the writer than the practice. What he was describing, read plainly, was a structured communal silence, conducted at sunrise with some kind of fire element at its center. That's not worship in any liturgical sense he would have recognized. It's something else. A second document fills in one more piece. A Ware County court record from 1873 references a complaint filed against a gathering of persons in unlawful assembly near a creek landing in the southwestern part of the county. The complaint was brought by a landowner whose property the group had apparently crossed to reach the site. Nothing came of it legally. The record shows the complaint was received and then not pursued, which in a county court of that era usually means a magistrate decided it wasn't worth the effort. But the record exists, and it describes the gathering in language close enough to the missionary letter that they're clearly describing the same kind of event. Neither document uses the term sun eaters. That name appears slightly later, in a Mission Society report from 1875, and the context makes clear it wasn't what the group called themselves. It was what the missionaries called them. The construction is contemptuous, the implication being that these people were so lost they thought they could consume something sacred just by sitting near it. Whether the people in that circle ever heard the name, or whether they would have recognized themselves in it, isn't recorded. What the fragments do give you, taken together, is a rough shape of the ritual. A pre-dawn assembly, probably 10 to 20 people, at a fixed outdoor location near water. A circle formation, with no one positioned above anyone else. A bowl or vessel holding coals or ash, which passed through the group or sat at the center. And a rule of silence so strict that the missionary's informant remembered it as the most disturbing part. Not the fire, not the hour, but the fact that nobody spoke a word until the sun was all the way up. That silence is where you have to start if you want to understand what they were actually doing there. Here's what we can say with reasonable confidence, and here's where confidence runs out. Those are two different lines, and keeping them separate matters. What's documented? A pre-dawn assembly at a fixed outdoor site, a circle with no hierarchy built into its shape, a vessel containing coals or ash, and a silence maintained from before sunrise until the sun cleared the tree line. That much appears across multiple independent sources with enough consistency that it's probably accurate. What's inferred, but not confirmed, the duration of the silence could stretch past midday on certain occasions, possibly tied to specific dates in the solar year. Some accounts suggest participants fasted before the gathering, though the evidence for this is thinner. It comes primarily from one WPA interview collected decades later, and we'll get to that when we reach that part of the record. So work from what you actually have. The silence is the hardest part for an outside observer to sit with, and it was clearly the hardest part for the missionaries to process too. In almost every 19th century evangelical context, religious practice was loud. It was call and response, testimony, hymn, the collective voice directed upward. The idea of a group of people sitting together in total silence as the central act of their practice, not as preparation for something else, not as a brief pause, but as the thing itself, had no category in the missionary's toolkit. He called it degraded worship, partly because he couldn't locate the worship in it at all. But enforced communal silence at dawn isn't unprecedented in folk practice across multiple traditions. What it tends to do, physiologically, is sharpen perception. Spend an hour before sunrise in a Georgia swamp without speaking, without the cognitive interference of language, and your senses reorganize. You hear things you wouldn't otherwise hear. You start to feel the temperature change as the light builds, not as an abstract fact, but as a physical event happening to your skin. The transition from dark to light becomes something you experience from the inside rather than observe from the outside. That's probably the eating in the name. Not consumption in any mystical sense, but absorption in a very literal one. Sitting with the sun long enough, in the right kind of silence, that the boundary between the observer and the thing observed starts to feel less fixed. The missionaries heard that description secondhand and turned it into mockery. But what they were mocking was a pretty accurate account of what extended mindful silence at dawn actually produces. The ash bowl is harder to trace. Fire as a purifying agent shows up across enough distinct traditions that pinning this specifically to one origin doesn't work. Among Scots-Irish settlers, hearth fire carried strong protective associations. Coals from a family fire kept alive through a move, embers shared as a gesture of connection between households. Among Creek communities in the region, fire held a central ceremonial role in the annual busk ceremony, the green corn ceremony, where the old fire was extinguished and a new sacred fire was kindled. Whether the ash bowl in the Sun Eater ritual was a direct descendant of either practice, a convergence of both, or something that developed independently inside the swamp, is genuinely unknown. What's clear is that it wasn't decorative. It sat at or moved through the center of the circle, and it was treated with enough deliberate care that multiple witnesses across different accounts mentioned it specifically. Something about the fire mattered to what the gathering was doing. The structure of the thing, the circle, the silence, the fire at the center, the waiting for the sun, adds up to a practice that is internally coherent without being externally legible. You don't need a text to run it. You don't need a trained leader to conduct it. Any group of people who knew the form could do it anywhere with a clear eastern horizon and a live coal. And that's exactly what made the church so uncomfortable. It wasn't frightening because it was strange. It was frightening because it was self-contained. It didn't need anything the church was offering. The Mission Society didn't move quietly. That's the first thing to understand about what happened next. The suppression of the Sun Eaters wasn't a whisper campaign or a slow withdrawal of goodwill. It was organized, it was documented in the Society's own correspondence, and it followed a recognizable playbook that had been used against folk practice in rural communities across the South since before the war. The strategy had 3 phases, and they ran more or less in order. First, identify. The circuit preachers began actively gathering names. They asked cooperative families, the ones who had accepted baptism, whose children attended the mission school, who had reasons to stay in good standing, to tell them who attended the gatherings. Some people talked. The names that surfaced in the Mission Society reports from 1875 and 1876 are fragmentary, but a few appear more than once. A man referred to only by surname, Tyson, shows up in 2 separate letters as someone the missionaries considered a ringleader, though nothing in the descriptions of the ritual suggests it had a leader at all. A woman identified as a widow living near the southwestern edge of Charlton County appears in one report as someone the Society intended to visit directly. Whether that visit happened and what came of it, the record doesn't say. She disappears from the correspondence after that single mention, which could mean she complied, or could mean the missionaries stopped finding her worth discussing. Second, shame. Once names were in hand, the pressure moved into the community. Men and women identified as participants were visited by preachers, spoken to in front of their neighbors at church gatherings, and, in at least 2 cases, named from the pulpit. The goal wasn't legal punishment. The county magistrates had already demonstrated they weren't interested in this, but social cost. In a community where your credit with a Waycross merchant and your standing at the local church were functionally linked, being named as a sun worshiper in front of your neighbors had real consequences. Third, and this is the part that actually worked, stop writing it down. By 1878, the direct references in both the mission correspondence and the county records fall off sharply. Not because the gatherings stopped, there's later evidence they didn't, but because the missionaries had apparently decided that continued documentation was giving the practice more weight than it deserved. One district superintendent wrote to a circuit preacher in late 1877, instructing him to discontinue detailed reports on the heathen assembly and focus instead on positive accounts of conversion and improvement. That's a bureaucratic way of saying, quit feeding it attention in the official record. The result is a silence in the written record from roughly 1878 to 1880 that looks, at first glance, like success. The gatherings vanished from the papers. But absence in a missionary report isn't the same as absence in a swamp. There's one account that the suppression campaign's advocates pointed to for years as evidence of a decisive break. A Baptist preacher named Clement Rowe, one of the more energetic figures in the regional mission push, wrote in 1879 that he had broken the assembly at the lower landing and that the participants had scattered and would not reassemble. He was specific about the date, specific about the confrontation, and confident in his conclusion. His account was circulated among the mission societies as a small victory. But Rowe's account has a problem. He described confronting a group of 11 people at a dawn gathering and reading scripture at them until they left. That's the entire incident. Nobody was arrested. Nobody recanted on record. Nobody signed anything or made a public statement. 11 people walked away from a preacher they didn't want to talk to, and Rowe called that a breaking. It wasn't. The WPA interviews collected 60 years later include at least 2 references from elderly swampers to dawn gatherings at water's edge that their parents or grandparents had practiced, described in language that maps directly onto the ritual Rowe thought he'd ended. The practice didn't break. It just stopped introducing itself to people who were going to write it down wrong. The Federal Writers Project came through southeastern Georgia in the mid-1930s, and the people they found along the Okefenokee's edge were old enough to remember the 1870s themselves, or old enough that their parents had. The WPA mandate was broad: collect folklore, dialect, local history, whatever was there. And the interviewers who worked this region were generally diligent. They wrote down what they heard. What they did with it afterward is a different question. The interviews that survive in the Georgia WPA collection include a handful that touch, sometimes directly and sometimes sideways, on something the interviewees called sitting with the light, or keeping the morning, or, in one transcript from a woman in her late 70s, interviewed near Folkston in 1937, just the circle. She didn't use the term sun-eaters. She'd never heard it, as far as the record shows. But she described her grandmother taking her to a gathering at a water landing before dawn, sitting in a ring with other people, a clay pot with coals in the center, and nobody making a sound until the sun was all the way up over the trees. That's 60-plus years of distance from the missionary letter, and the 2 descriptions match point for point. She told the interviewer her grandmother had called it cleaning out. Her grandmother's explanation, as best the woman could remember it, was that the silence was for letting the sun into the parts of you that noise had closed off. The interviewer noted the comment and moved on. There's no follow-up question in the transcript, which is one of the more frustrating gaps in the record, because that phrase, letting the sun into the parts of you that noise had closed off, is the clearest internal description of the practice's purpose that survives anywhere in the documentary record. Francis Harper, the naturalist who did extensive fieldwork in the Okefenokee between roughly 1912 and 1930, also touched the edge of this. Harper was there for the biology, primarily. He was cataloging species, recording dialect names for plants and animals, mapping the interior with a precision nobody had managed before. But he was observant about human practice, too, and his field notes from the 1910s include 2 separate mentions of swamper families who maintained what he called sun observances, gatherings he never witnessed directly, but was told about by the families themselves. He didn't pursue the subject in his published work. His notes treat it as a curiosity adjacent to his main project, rather than something worth investigating on its own terms. What Harper and the WPA interviewers share is a pattern of almost engagement. They got close enough to record that something was there, and then they stopped. The WPA interviewers had a practical reason. Their mandate prioritized folklore in the conventional sense, songs and stories and recipes, things that could be filed under recognizable categories. A ritual practice that didn't have a name anyone wanted to claim didn't fit the filing system. Harper's hesitation was probably different, a naturalist's reluctance to wander too far from his documented expertise. But here's what the combination of those 2 sources actually shows. 60 years after Clement Rowe declared the assembly broken, people were still doing it. Not loudly, not publicly, not in a way that invited the attention of anyone outside their own circle, but doing it. The practice had compressed inward, stripped of whatever visibility it once had, and continued in the specific way that things continue when they've learned that being noticed is dangerous. The swamp taught that lesson well. Everything that survived in the Okefenokee, survived by being harder to see than the thing hunting it. The question that keeps coming back when you trace this far into the record is a simple one. Where did it come from? Not in the conspiratorial sense, not some secret lineage passed hand to hand through the centuries, but in the plain historical sense. People don't build practices like this from scratch in a generation. The circle, the silence, the fire, the strict attention to the sun's position, that structure has roots somewhere, and the Okefenokee in the 1870s was fed by at least 3 distinct streams of tradition that could each have carried pieces of it. The Scots-Irish families who made up most of the swamper population brought with them a folk tradition from the British Isles that was older than any of the Protestant denominations those missionaries represented. Pre-Reformation rural practice in Scotland and Ulster included seasonal fire observances, communal silences at dawn on certain calendar days, and a working relationship with the sun as a timekeeper and a presence in ways that the Reformation had formally condemned but never fully extinguished. Those practices traveled in people's bodies and memories rather than in texts, so they're hard to document, but traces of them show up in Appalachian and Southern folk practice consistently enough that folklorists in the early 20th century coined the term Celtic survivals to account for them. It's an imperfect label, but the thing it points to is real. The Creek influence is harder to dismiss and harder to pin down. By the time the swamper families were established in the Okefenokee in significant numbers, the major creek removals were already decades in the past. But the Okefenokee had been creek territory living memory, and there were people along the swamp's edges in the 1870s with creek ancestry that showed up in family stories even when it didn't show up in any official record. The Creek Busk ceremony, the Green Corn ceremony, a full solar and agricultural new year centered on fire, silence, fasting, and collective renewal, was practiced in the region for generations before removal. Its structure overlaps with what the Sun Eaters were doing in ways that feel less like coincidence and more like transmission. The silence before the new fire, the circle, the waiting for the light. But the Okefenokee wasn't only Scots-Irish and Creek. Freedmen communities lived along the swamp's eastern and southern edges through Reconstruction, and some of them lived inside it. African American folk practice in the coastal Georgia and Florida region carried its own solar and fire traditions, some with roots in West African ceremonial structure, and some developed in the specific conditions of the American South. The convergence of those 3 streams, Scots-Irish, Creek, and African American, inside a geography that was simultaneously a refuge and a hiding place, is what most likely produced the Sun Eaters. Not a lineage, a synthesis, something that grew in the specific pressure and isolation of that swamp, from pieces that people carried in without knowing the others had carried something similar. That's actually why the church's suppression campaign was structurally incapable of working. You can forbid a named religion. You can dismantle an institution. You can remove a text from circulation. But this practice had no institution, no founding text, and no name until the missionaries gave it one. It existed in the overlap between 3 traditions that were each already hard to eradicate on their own. The parts that got pressed down in one community surfaced in another, carrying the same shape. So let's return to the question the whole record keeps circling without quite answering. Why did the church work this hard? Not every unusual folk practice in the rural South got this treatment. Root medicine got tolerated or absorbed. Animal signs got dismissed as superstition and left alone. Seasonal drinking got addressed with temperance campaigns. But temperance campaigns were about behavior, not belief. The Sun Eaters got something different. Sustained, organized, documented suppression across more than a decade. That gap between how the church treated other folk survivals and how it treated this one is where the real answer lives. The fear wasn't theological. That's the part that gets missed if you read the missionary letters at face value. When those letters called the practice heathen, they were reaching for the strongest language available to them. But the actual alarm in the writing isn't about eternal souls. It's about something much more immediate. The missionaries understood, even if they couldn't say it plainly, that the Sun-Eaters weren't a theological problem. They were a structural one. Think about what the church provided in a rural community in the post-Reconstruction South. Not just sermons. The church was where you established moral standing in front of your neighbors. It was where marriages got recorded, where funerals got conducted, where disputes between families got mediated by a figure with communal authority. The circuit preacher who showed up twice a year wasn't just offering salvation. He was the most visible representative of a social order that ran from the local congregation straight up through the mission society, the county seat, and on to denominational headquarters in Savannah or Atlanta or further north. That chain existed, and it needed people to be inside it to function. The Sun-Eaters weren't inside it. They didn't need it. Their circle had no ordained leader, which meant no one in it held authority granted from outside. Their gathering produced no converts and accepted no new members through any formal process. There was no collection, no building, no institutional debt. If you could sit in that circle at dawn and come out the other side with whatever the practice gave you, and the people who practiced it clearly believed it gave them something, then you had a source of meaning and communal belonging that the church couldn't tax, couldn't credential, and couldn't revoke. In the post-Reconstruction South, that kind of autonomy read as a direct provocation. The denominations pushing into the region weren't operating in a vacuum. They were part of a broader effort to rebuild social order in communities that had been fractured by war, by emancipation, by the violence of Reconstruction's collapse. A self-sufficient community practice that explicitly needed nothing from the institutions doing that rebuilding wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a demonstration that the rebuilding could be refused. That's what forbidden actually meant in this context. Not illegal. The county magistrates made clear they weren't interested in prosecuting it. Not formally condemned by any denominational council on record. Just pushed out of the written record with enough consistency and enough organization that the word forbidden is the only one that fits. Forbidden. The way certain knowledge gets forbidden. Not by banning it, but by making sure it never gets written down somewhere a stranger could find it. The church succeeded well enough that almost nobody outside the swamp has ever heard of the Sun-Eaters. It didn't succeed well enough to actually end them. The Okefenokee is still there. Most of it is federally protected now, absorbed into the National Wildlife Refuge System in 1937. And the interior looks much the way it looked in the 1870s. Blackwater channels, floating prairies, cypress stands so dense the light hits the water in narrow angles. The lower landings that appear in the Charlton and Ware County records aren't marked on any tourist map, but the geography they describe is still recognizable to anyone who's spent time in the southwestern quarter of the swamp. The documents themselves are scattered. The missionary correspondence that contains the earliest references is held across two archives, some at Emory University's Pitts Theology Library, which holds significant Methodist records from the Georgia region, and some in denominational archives that haven't been fully cataloged. The county court records from Charlton and Ware are partially digitized through the Georgia archives, but the relevant entries from the early 1870s require in-person access to the original ledgers. The WPA interview transcripts are held at the Library of Congress and have been partially digitized through the American Memory Project, though the Folkston interviews specifically are not among the fully processed collections. A small number of local historians in the Waycross area have touched this material, mostly in the context of broader swamper history rather than the Sun-Eaters specifically. The practice appears as a footnote in two self-published regional histories from the 1980s, both of which treat it as a curiosity. and neither of which traced it through the documentary chain carefully enough to see the continuity. Academic folklore scholarship has not addressed it directly. The synthesis that likely produced it, Scots-Irish, Creek, African American, falls across disciplinary lines in ways that make it easy to leave for someone else. Whether anyone still keeps the mourning in that form is not something the record can answer. What it can say is that the practice survived 60 years of active suppression and another 60 years of indifference, and that both of those things failed to close it off entirely. The swamp has always been better at keeping things than the people who wanted them lost. Same water, same dark, same eastern tree line, waiting to turn. What you know now that you didn't know at the start is what the Sun Eaters actually built, a practice with no walls, no ordained voice, no debt to any institution, something the church could not enter because there was no door to knock on. Subscribe if you want more stories pulled from the records nobody wanted kept. He walks into the swamp before the sun comes up, carrying nothing. No lantern, no rifle. The water is black and warm around his ankles, and the cypress trees close behind him like a door being shut from the inside. The air smells like rot and iron, and something older than both.